Well, hi, this is Justin again. I guess this is the 13th or 14th installment of um the Psychic Roots of Poetry. And I thought today that I'd go back into a little bit about the progression from the first mother to the muse. It's important, I think, and it's important also that we make a kind of distinction between the um psychic guiding voices that some of us hear from time to time. I'm not a big psychic, by the way. That in fact, in you talking about this, I would say that in fact my experiences are extremely limited, and they all occurred around 1979, 80. I'm sorry, 1989, 90. Uh, I'm getting so old now I forget how many years have passed, since those things happened. But I had a series of psychic events occur which absolutely overwhelmed me. And they happened to be around the period that I made a breakthrough into creating poetry in the way that our pre-literate ancestors created it. In fact, almost an exact counterpart, except it was in English and it was in the 21st century in terms of its diction and things like that. But outside of that, that in terms of its essentials, it was essentially about the same thing. And what I found out later when I started to consult with a series of psychics, because I didn't understand what was happening to me, and I for sure didn't understand the long mythic poem that came to me, which I call the Witness's Log, which an audio-visual version is playing in back of me here. I just keep playing it, and hopefully that if some of you are interested in it, you can go and you can download my book, Alice Hickey, Between Worlds, and there's a written version of it there, but there's also, you can have access, there's a your web link in the book to an access to the oral version of it. There are really two versions that came at different times, so they're essentially the same, but they are differences because the act of oral creation is essentially different than the act of written creation. And I've just spoken a bit about that. In theory, they should be the same, but the problem with writing is it's a very conscious act, and it tends to interrupt the flow from the muse, whereas speaking, once you get used to it and once you surrender to it, is a completely automatic act, and all you have to do is have the nerve to stay on the golden thread as the poem unwinds itself. But in fact, as a result of that long investigation with Alice Hickey, I really came to the conclusion that the work of Robert Graves about the white goddess is what he calls the mother goddess of the pre-literate periods, and the work of Julian Jaynes, which came out about the same time, but they seem not to have read each other, or there's not much head nodding in either way. When Jaynes spoke about the fact that pre-literate peoples heard the gods speak to them through the right lobe of their brain, which had language facilities at that time, something that's pretty much come to be accepted now. I think the poets accepted it immediately because they heard the voice of the muse, and what he says basically, Jaynes, is that the poets basically have a little piggy tail. That's what they call people who are born with little tails. That it's a kind of throwback to that time. They have a piece of that consciousness in them. In fact, we all have it, is what I found out about after a while. But it's just that it's most easily accessed by people who have a inborn poetic capability, meaning they can surrender to the unconscious and the muse, and if the muse is ready, will come forth with a poem. Not just words, but a poem fully structured, which is what I found out when I went into speaking. So it's very important to me to make clear to you that a poem can come out of you completely formed. It comes out in the form of a story. It's called a narrative poem, which was the only form of poem up until the 20th century. although we had some kind of variations around this around the 16th century in terms of things like sonnets and things like that, but they tended to be narrative in structure. This happened, you know. It's only when we get into the 20th century that we began to write in non-narrative forms, for better or worse, and that your poetry began to pull far away from its oral, spontaneous roots. And it stuck pretty close all the way through the invention of writing, to tell you the truth. But it's the printing press, when we had a widespread of literacy, that we saw a widespread introduction of written poetry and reading and the writing of it, you know. So the thing I thought I'd do is I'd just go back and I'd try to recap what I see, what I've come to conclude basically by my own studies, which are in Alice Hickey. There's a large appendix which contains most of my notes. I didn't put those in the book because I didn't want to, you know, weigh it down, so to speak, with that kind of thinking. But if you're interested in the kind of thinking behind Alice Hickey and the kind of thinking I had to go through in order to come up with some of the conclusions I've come up with, which are those that basically extend the work of Graves and of Janes a little bit. They really made major breakthroughs, you know. I'm just a fiddler on the roof here. I'm just putting little things on it, you know. But they're important to me because I think you should dot all your I's and you should cross all your T's, if for no other reason than to do something right is better than to do it half-ass, you know. And the work of Carl Jung also was extremely helpful to me, because I saw that your poetry was really an archetype, meaning it was a way of story creation that was within us, just as much as the idea of mother and father and ocean and drowning and all of those other things that, like Plato's ideal forms, are within us. And it would direct the formation of a poem. All you had to do was just speak as the muse spoke to you, and as it's sometimes in words, sometimes your lips move, you don't know what's going on, and then sometimes you see pictures and you speak it out, but you just faithfully try to stay on the golden thread as the poem unwinds itself, is handed you by the muse, and it will form and close itself, which is the killer. Close itself meaning it'll make the hair go up in the back of your neck, you know. So in fact, I came to the belief that your poetry is an archetype, and that it can be accessed, and it will direct the formation of the poem. All the work that poets go through today in modern poetry and contemporary poetry, I've done it myself too, is once the moment of conception passes, they start to fiddle with it for a whole variety of reasons. But because that's what we've been doing in the art of literature, really, since we learned to read and write. That in fact the words are on the page, so you move them around. You know, you start to change things, try to get different effects. But what I found, and for the most part, is that that's not important to me anymore. I can do it. Sometimes the effects are beautiful, sometimes they're not so beautiful. It's a waste of time. You know, Pound said at the end of his career it was a botch, and Marianne Moore said about the same thing when she took one of her famous poems that English professors love, and she chopped everything out except a couple of words, you know. And that was much to the horror of the critics, so you can't do that. But both Moore and Pound knew that they had been fooling around too much. And when they came down to the end result, that it was just a lot of tomfoolery, basically, is what I really consider it to be, you know. For what purpose? A poem is really a message between the unconscious, the soul, whatever you want to call it, doesn't make much difference. You know, what Jung said, he could easily equate in his mind the term unconscious, soul, and God. It didn't really present any problems to him in really doing so. They're both completely unknowable. That they both are extensions of our conscious life into the unknowable. And to me, that ancient form of communication, soul to self and self back to soul, it's a continuing loop. And you can see a lot of that in the in the remarkable fractal animation here, which just struck me as the way to really animate the witness's log, is that conversation, or that sending of a message unbidden to the conscious mind, which comes out in what we call a poem. It has some special characteristics as a story that in fact the conscious mind doesn't ask for it. It simply comes unbidden. It's metaphoric and it's rhythmic, and it brings about a moment of ecstasy. So it's a psychic event as well. We lose our current consciousness and we go into one that's very close to the orgasm we have in sex. And that is my own conclusion after a lifetime of doing this, is that the unconscious, the soul, God, whatever you want to call the unknowable, wants it back. We are a part of creation. Man is not like a little finger, an accident. That we are a very odd, mysterious part of creation itself, and that we are the way that the unknowable becomes known and praises itself. I guess that's the best way to put it. And in fact, the unknowable, whatever we want to think about it as, on a personal sense or just something that's beyond all knowing, is that it wants to feel its feelings come back to it with a little human glitter on it, with time added to it, which is the human dimension, which is uniquely human. So I see poetry as an event that brings about the mating of the conscious and unconscious mind. It's very important, I think, and the more you do it, the more whole you become, the more human you become, is how I see it. And it doesn't have to be fancy literary magazine, your quarterly poetry. All it has to be is unscrewed around with. It just has to, you have to let it come. You have to surrender to the archetype, the impulse when it comes, and you have to speak it out. Or if you want to take your chances, writing it out is much more difficult, because you're always going to be trying to investigate the thing that you're doing, and that's the worst thing you can do as a poet, with this type of poetry anyway, where you're trying to set up a rhythm between self and soul, conscious and unconscious, known world, unknowable world. Okay, so that's what you want to set up, and that, when we experience that moment of ecstasy, it's because we've become fully human. We found our mate, the mate being in this case the unconscious, and the conscious coming together. The unconscious is no stranger to us. It's like a brother. And we should treat it with that same kind of respect and wariness. It's very powerful. And it has its own life, and in fact we can ignore it, as many of us do. But of course we'll become aware of it the moment of our death. That's, excuse me, that's the moment that we can't ignore it. As Jung says, we can ignore it, and it will continue on its own life, its own grieving and its own joys, its own depressions, its own deaths. It will go on. They are our depressions, our loves, our griefs, our deaths too. We can ignore them, and we can drink, and we can stonewall it, and we can do whatever we want and wind up with facial tics and the rest of it. But it's going to get us in the end. It's far better to come together with it and to celebrate what it means to be human. That's what poetry is all about. All the rest of the stuff is nonsense. I shouldn't say it's nonsense. It's not important to me at this time of my life. It's not important. It was when I was younger. You wanted to get published, and I've been published, and I won enough prizes to know what I'm doing is not crazy. And I also know just by the feeling of the poetry that I'm doing, and the fact that I can tell a poem in a moment's notice from that which is not a poem. There's a lot of those out today. They're poems that are consciously constructed. Poems of the sun, Graves calls them. But let me go back to this thing about the first mother. I went into that last week in some extent, and it's a very powerful, I tried to explain as to why the first gods were not male. And I think it's pretty evident when we take a look that, in fact, without the mother, that humanness would not have been nurtured and forwarded. That's a very delicate thing. You're talking about suddenly a human animal being born of two animals and being able to tell stories, but there's nobody to tell them to. And it's also a consciousness which has been I kind of see it as a growth out of the animal consciousness, and what was left behind basically is the remnant of the animal consciousness, which became our unconscious and also our your gateway to all that is unknowable, in the sense that the animal lives completely in the present and seems to know things that we don't know, and that our own unconscious, which in fact was originally that animal consciousness, what was left of it basically, seems to know things beyond the boundaries of ourselves. It's the source of all prophecy, art. It's how we know what love is. It changed over the millennia because it's in constant communication with the conscious self, but the fact of the matter is, it's our feeling self is the best way to put it. It lives in a world. We don't know where that world is. It's within the body, and it seems to be extended beyond the body. So you figure it out. It just knows things that we could never know. That's as individuals. So that's partly in the work of Jung, that if you haven't read Jung, then in fact you should, to know how in fact you're really constructed, how mysterious we are as human beings. It's not as easy to understand as Freud with the male-female sexual thing, but in fact it's far more accurate as to what's happening in the human animal. So he was very helpful too in trying to figure out what was going on. What happens is, let's go back a little bit to the first mother, and as she grows in the stories that both she tells to her human offspring, and as the female mothers that are produced by her tell to their children and their children, what you have essentially is you have a story that in fact begins to grow. It begins to be a little bit of a tall tale, like all stories do, but the essentials are the same. The mother is creator, lover, destructress, as Graves calls her, enchantress, destructress, she's life, love, death. She's a complete, powerful force, as relayed by her and her stories to her young, and the stories of those young to their young as they went on, as they passed them on. And I tried to explain that those stories didn't have to be words. I think language came much later. But you can mime and you can use animal sounds to tell a story. And I think that's the way the first stories were told. We have to remember, because there were no stories before humans, that the first humans had no experience of stories. This is a little Einsteinian world I set up, just the mother and father animal and the little child female I took, just to show, make it a little simpler, but you can mess it up and you can go down many generations. The thing is still the same, is that the story gets reinforced, added to, because it's a true story, for one thing. In fact, that all humans owe everything to the first mother, because she made sure that the next human got it by nurturing that human and by creating stories and listening and seeing if the child spoke back. If it didn't speak back, didn't get it, then she knew it wasn't a human animal, it was another animal, which was possible in that kind of very jittery genetic stage, when you're going through a change. What happens in that process, because the first humans, what stories are, when you look at them, I did a lot of thinking about this, trying to get to the bottom of what this myth in back of me was all about. I was absolutely overwhelmed by it. I almost lost my mind for a while there, because there were no myths that I could find that had pieces of the myth that explain pieces of the myth behind me. They had come at a much later period in the pre-literate life. That's what I finally came to the conclusion of. And what this took is the moment of becoming human, the moment when we change to become witnesses, is what is called by the myth, which means story creators. Observe something and report it back. A story is different than just exclaiming "ah" or "ah," which is what the animals do. They're happy or they're sad or they're angry or whatever it is, or they're confused or neurotic, whatever. They don't know what to do. They're jittery. You see these poor dogs in the cages that have been rescued. But what is it? What is a story? It's a miracle. It was a change in evolution that somehow allowed a consciousness to develop out of animal consciousness that had access to the remaining animal consciousness, which is the feeling consciousness, and which went beyond that. I can't really explain too much beyond that, except that it seems to have gone beyond that, and that it was able to go into memory and to fashion a new world out of memory. This happened. I went down to the river and I saw you and loved you. You could do that with animal sounds and with mime. You can see the chimps do it, but they're never telling a story. They're simply expressing a current grief or rage or affection, whatever it happens to be. Those stories came from the unconscious. They were poems. They were the first poems. but they were constructing out of memory for the first time something that hung together. And one of the things that happened there, which I believe had to have happened at that stage, even before we had language, is that some gesture or some sound had to be invented to produce the words. Excuse me, let me take a piece of candy here. This is still the pollen season in Florida. I just drove back from Miami. It is blooming like crazy. Right down my throat here. Hopefully that'll take care of that in a few minutes. Excuse the sound, but I got to do it or I'll cough my brains out. One of the things that had to be created, and I found this when I did some translations. Maybe we'll show you the translations next week, of a Australian Aborigine by the name of Eldred Vinoy. They were written in a pidgin which is used in New Guinea, and they're probably also on the coast where he lived, which was in Queensland, which faces New Guinea. It's called Melanesian Pidgin, but I find it's true for all pidgins. One that, in fact, you'd be interested to know is that no matter what the pidgin is, whether it's a French-based pidgin or an Oriental-based pidgin or an American English-based pidgin or a Dutch-based pidgin, that they all have extremely small vocabularies, maybe 100 to 400 words at most, that they use. But they all have the same structure. That is, by the time we reach a little beyond the hunter-gatherer stage, which you could say is the truth in New Guinea, before we began to change those cultures, is that they were farming a bit, but they were hunting too. The hunter-gatherer farmers, living a very tribal life. At that stage, that all of the basics of language and sentence formation and everything like that were all in place. And how they were able to express themselves beyond that very limited vocabulary, when it's said that the average educated person has about 40,000 words that they know, and these are 400. And I did some experiments, and I found out that this is basically true, is that they use gestures and tone. The same word might be used for 10 different things, but how it's said and how you use your hands, and that gives meaning to that particular word. That's very, very, very similar, I think, to what happened to human beings when they first started to produce language. And that's a whole different subject I'm going to take up in a couple of weeks, language itself, But it can start very simply, and you can say very complex things, by the way. But to really say very, very complex things and to get the nuances, and it's especially true as you move towards the world of writing, when we started to trade and all those writing alphabets developed, that you have to have a more complex language, and you'll have many, many more words and many more kind of nuances, because you want the written document to contain everything. You don't have anybody through the gestures, which they would do in the original. If you read some of the thing on Jane's as to how the original written documents were used, somebody would kind of just speak them out and would kind of gesture. They didn't have that much flexibility yet in terms of the alphabets, in terms of vocabulary. But one of the things that I noticed when I looked at the work of Vinoy is that there was a word for and, but, and then it was always the same word. It was nah. Nah, 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 nah. You know, I went down to the river and I saw you, and then you ran away, but I loved you, and then you said to me, then here's what we're going to do, but not now. So all those little conjunctions are all one word. Excuse me again. And how we know that it's and, then, but, or, whatever, is the expression of the speaker. But it got me to thinking as to, excuse me, let me just, it got me to thinking, where did the human rhythmic speech come from? That's at the basis of poetry. Where did rhythm come from anyway? You know, people say, oh, well, that's what, well, the birds have rhythm. They go tweet, 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 tweet. But that's not rhythm. That's repeated sounds. Any jazz musician will tell you that that's not rhythm. Rhythm is an overlaid beat structure, I guess you could call it. That is overlaid either speech or music. And it's my belief that the very first, you don't have to call it word, but language, non-animal language, was something that allowed the animal to say and, then, but, or, so. You know, all those things are basically ways of progressing a story, because a story goes from beginning to end. It doesn't go from middle to beginning to end. It doesn't go from end to middle to beginning. We have no choice in the matter. The fact of the matter is that stories always begin, they have a middle, and they end. That's the way it comes to us, just like our dreams have a beginning and they have a middle and an end. You know? You really can't, you can try and twist it as people have in modern times, and all you get is a headache. The human psyche wants a story with beginning, middle, and end. It's the clock that set time up. Beginning, middle, end. That's how we see the world. That's how we describe the world. That's how it's always been described since the beginning of time, since the first story was done. Okay? And that's exactly what sets time up. To be human is to be a story creator and to live in time, because time exists within the story. It progresses. It starts, it does something, and it ends. And then it starts again, it does something, and it ends. And it goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, and every story ever told, ever made. In order to progress the story, you need something that's a conjunction, that something says and thus and so and if, you know. And you'll see in Pidgin, it's a very simple word. It's usually only one word, and it just serves as the glue that brings things together. That I believe is the beginning of rhythm. And in fact, I have even some suspicions that it happened before we even started to play with language. We were still in the animal sound and the mime business. Some gesture or something was invented, came to somebody to suggest that and, or, thus, but, whatever it happens to be, and then have the appropriate gestures as you see fit, because in fact the gestures are a lot easier to come up with, since they're part of our animal vocabulary as well, than in terms of words, which everybody has to understand. That's one of the mysteries that in fact we'll go into a little bit later. So that there was a rhythm that was set up in the human speaking. When the humans are telling each other the stories, which are these feelings about that the first mother told about herself and about who she was and about how she created them, and that were retold by others, are feelings. Story is a way that we communicate feelings. It doesn't matter whether it's John Updike or whether it's a simple two-sentence story. It's trying to transmit a feeling from one person to the other. And these were coming from the unconscious. They had all the power of poems, and they were coming up about the first mother. and then she and the mother, whatever they use for mother, whatever is mother. So what happens is it gets a rhythm that's not a repetitive rhythm. It comes as a kind of emphasis. It was that, I believe, for example, that when we finally get the mother goddess, so to speak, becomes a part of our unconscious. Okay, at some stage it did. That I think that the first appearance of the mother goddess, and don't forget that these people, they had psychic experiences when they experienced the mother goddess. At some stage, the unconscious wanted to communicate with us, and it needed something. I told you about the little thing about your poetry is like a ball of fire that is looking to come into the world, and about that little Spanish Mexican star that's made out of mirrors, that's three-dimensional. And really what the conscious and unconscious mind do at some stage is they find an approximation. A ball of fire is forming. It wants to come out. It wants to make something in space and time, and it puts together very quickly this three-dimensional Mexican star with the mirrors that reflect the world and you and all the people in the story and the birds and the bees. It puts it together very quickly, and it tries to get a rough fit to the fiery flame of feeling. Somehow is what makes, if we can just look at it today, what makes dreams difficult to interpret, and sometimes poems as well, because that fit is never exact. It comes up as a metaphor. It's a rough approximation. You can think of it that way. That the feeling is trying to find something in consciousness that it knows that it can, that if that consciousness will accept, then it will take in, and that will come into the world of space and time. So that the one thing that the unconscious knew is the feelings about the mother goddess. And at some stage it's going to start to want to, because it's always a two-way conversation, we could be talking to each other about the first mother, this and that. And we have in our minds as animals, since we're just doing sounds and grunts and things like that, but we're telling and like that, but it happens to be, is that at some stage that the unconscious is going to come up with its something it wants to say, some set of feelings, and the thing that's going to best match it is going to be the physical resemblance to the first mother or the mother goddess or some approximation of it, That is going to appear to your pre-literate human right in their consciousness, and they'll hear that voice. It'll be animal sounds now. The projected mother goddess is going to come out with all of the power of the vision. Let's say it's some idea, if you've never had a psychic experience, that there are two kinds of visions we have today, and they're very infrequent today because our whole consciousness is one which blocks them out. But one is when we have close encounters of the third kind, where people see aliens, and they come into their lives and they take them away somewhere. And the other are the religious visions, such as of Fatima and Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, which are two modern ones. There's no doubt that those are visions. People will like to say, well, they're hallucinations, but I think people who are familiar with psychic experiences, they're not hallucinations, they're not distortions. They're the unconscious coming forth. And for a spiritual person, the best fit it's going to find today is probably going to be the Virgin Mother to communicate. And for those who don't believe in that, who are in the world of science and business, the best fit are aliens. It happens to be a kind of coincidence, and it's not a coincidence really, is that the facial characteristics of the aliens that have come down in time with the very large eyes, and you really can't see the mouth or anything, are exactly what pre-literate peoples used to bring forth the gods to speak to them. They were like mesmerizers with the big eyes. And then they'd have the visions, and they'd have the voices come to them. They were in every household, according to James. And they're remarkably identical to what we see in the aliens. The aliens, they have little sticky fingers and stuff like that, but what's really important is the eyes. That was not something somebody dreamed up. That's the way that in fact, the unconscious knows that that's a pretty good fit for something coming up from the unconscious that, in fact, we knew it for tens of thousands of years. It kind of fits in with all the rest of it into our way of thinking. That's an acceptable Mexican star for people who aren't religious and spiritual. Both are eruptions of the unconscious into the conscious mind, trying to tell us something. And those messages and those visions are metaphors. They have to be treated like that in order to see what do they really mean. Okay, I'm not going to get into that, but I just wanted to give you some idea as to how the unconscious tries to find a fit in the conscious mind so it can speak to us specifically, more so than it had before. The whole dialogue has started. We started out in telling stories to each other. We developed a kind of rhythm. All of a sudden, what we find out is sooner or later that the unconscious wants to transmit to us a more complex feeling, and it finds that since we're obsessed with the mother goddess, it finds that fit, that both conscious mind and, in fact, unconscious agree it's a good enough fit. And that's how it appears to us in that psychic experience to those first humans. And that the speech is going to be rhythmic, because what the unconscious has learned as it's heard these, it's really heard the feelings, And in fact, it picked up that, in fact, the rhythm is the rhythm imparted by humans. It's time. It's their feelings, okay, which have been fashioned into a story by the humans to each other, which are really poems, is really what they're doing, They were probably possessed when they were speaking to each other, just like in terms of poets are. I speak to men and to gods, as Homer said, and that would have been the experience, basically, of humans. They would have been possessed. The story would have come out of them. It would have little rhythms to it, and the new feelings, the new human feelings in time, in fact, would have been absorbed by the unconscious, which knows mothers, and has eventually things to say. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm going to amplify what I said to you a couple of weeks ago, is that humans imitated the rhythmic, metaphoric speech of the gods in speaking to them, but it was humans who taught it to the gods in the first place. And by the gods I mean not the utterly unknowable, which in most pre-literate cultures, and even up into some of our literate cultures, there's an unknowable God, the life force, whatever you want to think of it. In the Greeks, it was the Fates, and some of the pre-literates. There are all kinds of gods, which are really like faces of gods, but they're not the unknowable. There's some part of the unknowable which has chosen to project itself into our lives. The God of Moses would be one example of that. The God of Joseph Smith would be another example of that. The God of Buddha would be another example of that, okay? The God of Mohammed, whatever it happened to be. These are faces of the unknowable that have come into time at a specific time, and they have force. They're not hallucinations, because they move great numbers of people, for long times, too. They stop and start civilizations. But they are not the unknowable. You can call it the life force. There is something beyond the gods always. And in fact, we can see it really in the Greeks, who have a kind of like They're very terrible gods, and Zeus and Hera, but they're like clowns too, in a certain extent. They're just like the human beings. They're just exaggerated more, but in back of this, something else is ticking and moving. And the pre-literate people saw this too, by the way. If in those where I believe that the myths have been translated correctly by the anthropologists, in many cases there's something in the back that's moving, that's beyond knowing. And then we have the other gods that come in and that sees our attention through a psychic experience that pre-literate humans were having all of the time. So I think I just brought you through a little bit here. I hopefully made it clear as to how suddenly to after many generations that the unconscious would project a psychic image into the minds of pre-literate humans, which were very fragile and conscious. They slipped between the unconscious, the psychic world, and the conscious world like that, and that there would be the appearance of the Mother Goddess. The Mother Goddess is not like the Virgin Mary in the Catholic churches. That was an altar boy. You look at the Virgin Mary, she's a nice plaster statue. This was real. It grabbed you. It was like the Virgin of Fatima. It just seized the attention of those three children, and it changed them, and it had such force that it really changed thousands and thousands of people who came to attend those. They knew something was happening. Whether you believe it or not important. They are eruptions into the world of time and space by the unconscious, by the psychic realm, whatever you want to call it. And they have power and they have force. And if you don't think that they do, then you just really, you have to wake up. Faces of God are the God of Moses. That essentially started the Hebrews into history, real history. Where they had an enormous impact upon the rest of the civilizations and things like that. So we have to really think of these eruptions of the unconscious, and they seize upon a face somehow, a face or an appearance or a voice, whatever it takes to be a vision, that is an approximation of something that is known in consciousness, and it makes its appearance and it speaks and all the rest of it. But in fact, it's not the unknowable, which is why we have so many versions of God and completely different things that they say. So that's a problem, isn't it? No, they're not bad things they're saying, but in fact, they're all partial revealings of the unknowable. And you can take them for that, and you could be guided by them, or in fact, you could be not guided by them. Out of that, eventually, that incarnation into human consciousness of this very real vision of the Mother Goddess, which is the way the unconscious eventually chose to project into us, to speak to us, one of the many ways. Probably there were lots of animal ways too at the same time. The animal totems were very big for pre-literate people. They could have happened at the same time, because we know that all pre-literate peoples take an animal as their spiritual guide. So that was probably happening at the same time. They're very close to the animals. They lived in a kind of world that went between animal consciousness, which is our unconscious, and between our new human consciousness. They were constantly drifting back and forth. It was very easy to mind meld, as we would say, with the animals as their guides, because the animals knew things, Somehow they were always that all these guides turned out to be very, very beneficial for the humans. That's a little mystery too. Of course, that doesn't say that the results were always that they continue to thrive forever. As we know that in fact there comes a time to die, and you have no better example of that than the Mayan projections, that their own prophecies that saw that there would be some white bearded individuals that would come from the east, and that would end that particular cycle of civilization. All they could do was go to their doom. That's why they couldn't really stand up to the Spaniards. There were hundreds of thousands of them and 24 Spaniards, whatever the number was. It's crazy. They just folded. So that when you get those psychic experiences, you can just simply say to yourself, is that's the unfolding of the unknowable, and all you can do is you can follow it to your impending fortune or doom, but it's the path you have to take, and that's the way it unfolds, like a great play. You can think of, I sometimes think of, if you wanted some way to think of the unknowable, it's like a dreaming. You know, that in terms of the Aborigines have it right. There's a dreaming that is always taking place. Sometimes called a dream time, so what happened at one time. It's not, it's a dreaming. And then within the dreaming are their gods, their snake god, their serpent god, the rest of it. They can communicate with them, but they can't communicate with the source of the dreaming. Nor can we. We can talk to the God of Abraham or the God of Jesus, whatever happens to be, if we're so inclined, you know, if we are able to do that. We don't have however, those same powerful experiences that were had by pre-literate peoples where those gods actually entered their lives. That's a whole different kettle of fish there, isn't it? Than just something we read in a holy book or a Bible or something, and oh yeah, you know, this will grab you by the throat, you know. And so that kind of incarnation of the first mother as the mother goddess, you know, the bringer of civilization, the bringer of life, bringer of death, the ruler of everything. Out of that eventually came, which I'll go into next week a little bit more detail, is a slightly different incarnation of that particular beautiful and terrifying God, and that is the Muse. Slightly different as to how that developed, I think, and I want to go into that just a little bit more. So I'm going to leave you with a little nice, mysterious dream story. I'll see you next week.
Whenever I come to see you, it's such a long, hard walk, and you're never there. Only the empty room and my shadow. No one to step between us, between the man at the door and myself. I don't know where I'm going anymore. I seem lost in memories or awakenings. Only my other self knows where I'm going and where I've been. I don't know anything anymore. I'm in a white room and then I think I'm climbing to heaven. And then I'm all alone somewhere. This is where the dead are buried. And this is where I've come to be with you. Everything changes here, just like the day changes from morning to evening. And just the thought of you makes the colors in my mind go wild. If I could find you, I would pull you up from the earth and speak to you and tell you who I am here in this graveyard of bones. Each night I knock at your door and wait for you to come, but you never do. There are only dreams, dreams of memories and memories of dreams in the long, long road back to where I live, by myself, with you. Here I am, again.